Oh, very good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us in this online conversation, child labor from a gender perspective in the context of crisis in Latin America and the Caribbean. This event is part of a series of events that we are organizing in the regional initiative, Latin America and the Caribbean, together with UN agencies in order to provide information and context analysis in order to make a contribution to the improvement of child labor eradication in the regional countries in the current crisis context. Before delving into the topic, I would like to share with you some methodology and technical topics. We have English, Spanish interpretation, simultaneous interpretation. Speakers will be speaking Spanish and interpreters will be interpreting into English. If you are accessing through a computer, at the bottom you will find an interpretation icon, a globe icon, and there you will be able to choose your language. If you are using a mobile device, at the bottom of the screen, you will find a plus or three dots, and you will be able to choose the language of your preference. This conversation, this meeting, will have first 15-minute presentations by the speakers, and then we will have a period for questions that you can send us using the chat functionality, which is located at the bottom of the screen. So we will select a few questions because we have time constraints, and the speakers will be able to provide their answers to your questions. And now, without further ado, I would like to welcome Raquel Coelho, an expert on women's empowerment from UN Women, Yvonne Urriola, Development Officer from UNICEF, Neus Bernabeu from the UN Population Fund, and Maria Arteta, a colleague and a gender and non-discrimination expert from the ILO. Before fully going into the topic, I have a request. We have interpretation, so please speak not too fast in order to make it easier for the interpreters to translate your message into English so that everyone can follow us or you in English and understand your ideas much better. This crisis has shed light on gender equality deficits regarding the guarantees of rights because it is a global crisis. And we have seen once again that women, which is over half of the world's population, are more exposed regarding health because the healthcare economy is feminine, especially because poverty, informality, labor informality affect women the most. These aspects and others are interrelated with the persistence of child labor. Gender inequality has a clear nexus with child labor, even if it is not included in some of the initiatives and actions that we implement, and it affects millions of children, boys and girls, and their families. In a context with young girls are affected by the economic and global crisis, we think it is especially important to place our focus of attention on the solution to this problem, because prevention and eradication of child labor have to do with vulnerability among girls and communities. We will see some presentations at this meeting, and we will tour around different intersections between gender, child labor, and other aspects. So now, without further ado, I will give the floor to the first panelist. Maria, good morning. So the ILO has placed their focus on the region on this topic, especially child labor in the last 25 years. What analysis do we have? What conclusions and lessons have we learned with a gender perspective? Thank you very much. And I'd like to say hello to all of my colleagues, the other panelists, and all of you out there. I think this is a very relevant topic, and we have not analyzed it deep enough in order to see child labor with a gender perspective, with a gender lens, I would say. So, okay, thanks for the first slide. Until the beginning of the COVID pandemic in Latin America, the latest statistics were these 10.5 million of young boys, girls, and teenagers working, as child workers, most of them in dangerous activities, 6.3 million. This was good news because you see the trend, it was a downward trend. However, it was not quick enough in order to attain the 8.7 million goal of the ODS, and 2025 was the deadline for the eradication of child labor. Most of the child labor in Latin America and the Caribbean is dangerous work. However, we don't know what's going to happen after COVID. Now we know that many of the families which are affected by child labor or who work in rural areas, indigenous families, informal workers, are the most vulnerable people. And we don't know for sure what risk young boys and girls face because they can go back to child labor. We don't want this going backwards. And we don't want our figures to go up again. I think that the first thing we should do, next slide, please. I think the first thing we should see from the gender perspective is to give visibility to these young girls and teenagers, because figures don't give them visibility. Even if the numbers, the statistics, the latest date back from 2016, you see, they tell you there are more boys than girls out there doing work, 58% of all boys, and most of those doing dangerous work are boys, according to these statistics. But this does not create visibility, does not show visibility to the work which is done at home by girls. As in the case of labor statistics, we collect numbers, figures about child labor using the household survey. This means that all the work which is done by girls, at home, domestic work, unpaid work, is invisible. And also is invisible the work done by women regarding care, the provision of care. So there are some rural agricultural work on small family household farms. There are some domestic chores at home, and many of the girls have to work very long days, not only because they work out there on the farm, but also they have to do domestic work, which is invisible. So apart from this work done by girls in agriculture, in the services sector, in the rural sector, which are they are the majority of workers, and they also have to do work at home. And some which don't seem to be working out there is because they work at home, they do domestic work. And this might entail a day which is too long for these girls. I think, next slide, please. So the gender roles that we see out there on the labor market for adults are reflected in the area of child labor. And this means that these roles, which are extremely prevalent, are the same roles played by young boys, girls, and teenagers. Girls devote at least, this is our estimate, the girls below 15 devote 21 hours per day to care activities, and this is not seen anywhere else, reflected by statistics. Girls are also exposed to hazards which have not been the focus of attention of this investigation, especially the youngest girls who might be working with machinery, or maybe they do the ironing, they have to use chemical substances to clean, to wash up, and they are exposed to hazards we have not quantified. I think it's important to understand that we have to conduct a specific analysis, focus on domestic child labor done by girls in order for us to understand the real role they play and give visibility to this kind of labor, which is invisible for adults and it's invisible for these young girls. And at times, these young girls are sent out to do domestic work at someone else's place. That's unpaid work as well. And this unpaid domestic work is invisible when we do household surveys, because when people are asked a question during the survey, they don't consider this proper work, but some kind of help or assistance, or even help for these girls so that they can have a roof, uh, a meal. And this has been normalized, accepted as a norm, as not as a work. Next, thank you. According to statistics, girls don't face so much hazardous or dangerous work as boys, but we have to focus on the worst forms of child labor. Many of these worst child labors are illegal, and therefore these tasks are very difficult to pinpoint and quantify, but we do know that girls face more risk to this kind of commercial sexual exploitation, forced labor, and bonded labor. We have some figures that allow us to give more visibility to this problem. According to the UN office, UNODC, they say that 20% of all the victims of child traffic are girls. And this percentage is much higher than that for boys, which is around 8%. And sexual exploitation is also much more prevalent among girls than among boys. So there are some situations regarding unpaid domestic work which might be considered forced labor, even when people are not fully aware that this kind of work, which they consider help, is forced labor. If they cannot leave the house, if they are sort of cooped up in a room, if they work in very harsh conditions, this might be considered forced labor. Maybe the pandemic will make these girls, boys, and teenagers more vulnerable to these unlawful forms of work, to this dangerous work, because families may in the future face more dramatic situations, especially the more vulnerable households where you find child labor. In the region, there is a huge number of people in rural areas, in the Amazon area, and there's human traffic there, there's forced labor there, and they're all in a situation of great vulnerability because of the pandemic. They are facing hunger, they are in a very fragile situation. Next slide, please. I also believe that we should try to analyze the link between paid domestic work and unpaid domestic work. I think that in Latin America, you know, in the case of care, yeah, you have lots of workers at home, and this kind of work, this kind of labor, uh, still does not meet proper conditions. It is part of the uh, gray market, let's say. There is no proper remuneration, no proper working conditions, and these domestic workers are victims, I mean, of the pandemic, whether because they are exposed to the virus, because they have to come and to commute, because they have to care for other people as part of work, or because they have been fired, so to say. So in this condition of fragility, young girls will be more prone to dropping out of school. Many have already dropped out of school in order to start doing work. And you know, the only way out of the situation is do some domestic work. It's important to give visibility to this kind of work and labor. Also, if paid domestic workers are in a better position, the more chances of protecting young girls we will have in our hands. So, and it's important to take into account that this invisibility of the work done by girls is something we have to tackle by improving data collection and statistics. If we don't have proper statistics that recognize unpaid work as a kind of work which provide economic value to unpaid work, the work done by these girls and teenagers and women will remain invisible for everyone. Now we have statistics about the use of time, and we can provide visibility to unpaid domestic work, but many times you start collecting data when these girls are 15, but that's too late, so we don't get enough information about the work done by girls 5 to 15, as we now collect in most of the Americas or Latin America regarding paid work.
Now, if we are to do justice for these young girls and adolescents, it's important to have data so that exploitation is not longer the case. And during the COVID pandemic, there are more risks. The risk that people, their families get poorer, the vulnerability of people also is heightened, and girls drop out of school. They study more than boys, but they drop out of school. So that makes it more difficult for girls to go back to school after the pandemic. Now, if we are to have an effective eradication of child labor in Latin America, we need to see the situation through this lens, this gender lens, something that we have paid more attention to in the work done by agencies to reach equality for women, but we haven't focused that much attention on child labor, and we should do that for policies to be effective. Thank you very much. Thank you, Maria. It's true. I mean, some of the information that you gave about domestic child labor and the need to have more evidence-based data. So now I'm going to give the floor to Raquel Coelho. Raquel, in this crisis, it's more evident than ever that the care economy requires more help from public policies to contribute to gender equality and fairer societies. And this is very much related to the proposal made by the International Labour Organization and the eradication and prevention of child labor. So what's the analysis of UN Women in this case? Thank you. Thank you, Anna. I would like to thank the International Labour Organization for organizing this event that gathers all of us around common problems to find also common solutions. And let me especially greet Yvonne, Anna, and Maria, with whom we have done a lot in the regional interagency group. Now, if you want, we can move to the next slide. I will try to go deeper into the links to care and child labor. Maria has already given important elements in her wonderful introductory presentation, so I will try to delve more into detail. Now, before trying to talk about childcare, now let me give you an overview of what we mean by care, because care is all the activities related to generating the physical, emotional well-being of people. So it's home care, domestic care, take care of your body, training, education, the maintenance of social relationships, and psychological support. So important now in the COVID times. So in fact, the whole set of care work comprises many activities that are necessary for our daily work or operation. And you see that in the healthcare field, home, and children and dependent people. So those all people in life require care at some point, but at certain points in your life you will need more intense care. That's why it's basic to talk about child care. Children, boys and girls, until they reach certain age, require direct support and care, and then as they grow older and until adolescence, they require care, support, and being accompanied. Now, it's important to understand this framework because, as Maria pointed out, most of the care work is done unpaid, in an unpaid manner, by women, and at home. The time that we devote to childcare is also part of a bigger bag that we had to take from other types of care. So we struggle for the care work that is unpaid to be restructured and reorganized. We can also devote more quality time to childcare, that should be, I mean, it's unavoidable that it's assumed by parents. So the importance of care is clear. The objectives are very important. They are highly strengthened when they have right conditions. The household care allows them to prepare them for future training. All the emotional care is important, but this care that we devote to unpaid work for childcare at households, it has to be made compatible with other needs and other responsibilities that people have in our labor environment, in the personal environment. So we need a comprehensive approach to take into account the needs of boys and girls and the needs of families, the needs of men and women, and the people that provide care, so that not everything falls in the domestic environment unpaid and on the shoulders of women, so that we can have a social structure responding to needs and care without this overburden, but allows us to meet the needs of childcare. Next, please. But besides, we should try to talk and invest in good systems in good services in terms of childcare is not only necessary because of the reasons mentioned before, but it's also very, very important because UN agencies have been working on this, like UNICEF. There is a triple dividend when you invest in child care. Now, there is a direct return on investment coming from the training and education that boys and girls receive. There is one part of emotional support for children that children should get at home. All the professional care, attention through early education, child education, prepares them, gives them better tools in order to be able to continue in the educational cycle with more skills. And this is very, very important for those boys and girls that live in poor environments where the academic support coming from other external factors won't be so reinforced. So to invest in childcare has clear returns in human capitals, effective effects and impact in the development of children. The second benefit is that investment in childcare allows you to create quality employment when it is done correctly in terms of decent labor through healthcare professionals or care professionals in general. So, as the International Labor Organization says, this should be labor intensive. In most sectors where we see labor in the future, it's not going to be labor intensive, but care is labor intensive because it has to be personal. We have washers, perhaps in the future we'll have robots that will help us with the domestic work, but it is labor intensive and it generates then jobs, and when those jobs are given characteristics of decent labor, because as Maria said in her presentation, many of the people working in paid care jobs have worse working conditions, lower wages. So this is a type of work that is less remunerated. It's not appreciated if it is unpaid because it is invisible, but when it is paid, it is also less appreciated. So if we inject decent conditions, decent working conditions to care workers, we will be able to gain returns into taxes, better social security contributions. So one part of what is invested goes back to the public treasury. And the third benefit and the third return from this investment in childcare is that you reduce the opportunity cost of women to go up to the labor market, because there are many studies that show that there is a clear relationship between the low rate of employment participation of women with the type of quantity of time dedicated to unpaid work. And when women have accessible, affordable means to get a job, because the costs can be paid by men, women, and society in general, women join the labor market. So this means an increase in income, in household income, and that helps make consumption more dynamic, improve quality of life, etc. So it's important to take into account that when you invest in care, this investment generates multiple benefits. Next slide, please. Although it is true that, although this has been quantified, in the region, there are benefits and challenges at the time of implementing care services that are inextricably linked to the creation or generation of child labor. One is that rendering of child care services by the state still has low coverage. It's unequal, is not always affordable or accessible, it's not well distributed, and some services are of poor quality. So it's not a possibility for many of the families, especially families that come from rural or poor backgrounds. And when there aren't good care services, many of the families get into this dynamic of making children develop or do part of the child care because they don't go to school or go less time to school. So there are some challenges in terms of rates or tariffs or the working time that don't agree or coincide with the time that parents have to go to work, and the insufficient investment in quality. It's not only scope coverage, but also quality levels that will make families trust health or care facilities, childcare facilities. So in 31 countries, developing countries, where the study was conducted, 4% of women said that they were using child care services, and 40% said, no, we take care of our own children. So the consequence has a direct impact, which is inextricably linked to women and their lack of access to paid jobs for women. They don't access because it is conditioned by childcare. When they do, it is partial time in informal sectors that allow them to reconcile that with their childcare obligations, but also with less rights and less services, and they are not so well paid. And the impact is huge also on child labor, because when children don't have access to education services from early childhood, there is more risk that over their lives they will be able to get into child labor. So next, please. Now, these were the challenges up until March without COVID. Now, what happened since the pandemic struck? And COVID has had serious impact in the environment of care. This was mentioned in the introduction. Women are at the front line of response. Women account for 69 to 75% of healthcare workers. Many of them are nurses, they are more exposed. So when we have broken down data, we see that the number of women infected is higher. There has been an important work done at home, that is unpaid work with the emotional and physical costs that this presupposes. And before the pandemic, it was estimated that the financial contribution of women into the healthcare system, both paid and unpaid, amounted to 5% of the global GDP.
So now, with the pandemic, women remain in this first line of action. And who cares of provides care to these young girls, the children of healthcare workers? How do they arrange to do their work and to care for their children? Then, next slide, please. You see, the pandemic, or let's say, before, as I said, before the pandemic, there was a crisis in the organization of care labor. Unpaid involves half of the working time, and we know that in our region, um, women devote three times more to doing this kind of work, not only childcare but also domestic work, etc. But this kind of work has gone up because of the crisis. On the one hand, there has been an exponential increase in the number of people. So we have children at home more time because schools are not operating. We have to care for sick people, dependents, the elderly, and much of this care is a distance care, we would say. So in that case, we have to go to the supermarket, do the shopping, buy supplies for people who don't live in our household, and also an increase in educational work at home. Some families have been able to access virtual learning, online learning. So the support for homework, yeah, has grown as well. There has been an increase in home activities, an increase in chores, tasks, preparing food, cleaning up, washing up, etc., etc., etc. And of course, something which is also invisible. There has been an increase in the mental burden, many more concerns in our heads, in our minds. However, every formal arrangement, school, daycare center, domestic work, domestic workers uh, have been confined at their own home. We had some informal arrangements. I mean, things we did with family, with neighbors. So we cannot resort to that now because many of the people involved in these informal arrangements, the elderly, they are at risk, vulnerable. So now they cannot take care of our children, for instance. The third link, the ILO has worked a lot in this area. As I said, women are much more prevalent in the area of underemployment and the informal sector. And these two areas or also access to labor, I mean part-time work, have to do with the possibility to come to find a kind of compromise between work and care, but in a situation of crisis, where in the informal sector work don't provide access to health care, and people in the informal sector uh, end up having no income at all. In this sector, women are much more severely affected. And finally, something mentioned by Maria, I would like to shed more light on this as well. We've been working with ECLAC and the ILO, and we have published a policy brief on the impact of domestic workers. And this is the impact, I mean, COVID's impact on paid domestic workers. We know based on ECLAC and ILO data that between 11 and 18 million people in the region do this kind of work, and 93% are women and some young girls. Maria said that 67% of all boys and girls doing domestic work are girls. And this was said by Maria, and some of them in condition of semi-slavery or forced labor or without any kind of wage or benefit. Many of them are migrants, and this worsens discrimination and the lack of protection uh, faced by this group of people. And up to 77.5% of women in the region work in the informal sector. I will not mention the countries, but there are some countries in the region where uh, up to 10% of the workers at home have a social security. So you see, they are very vulnerable, a very vulnerable group, and this is also translated in what happens regarding care and healthcare. This situation leads to precarious conditions with no protection, and it has been worsened because of COVID, because many of these people don't have access to unemployment benefits, or maybe they don't have any access to public health care. They are now unemployed. They don't get any benefits. And according to ILO data and statistics, up to 70.4% of domestic workers have been affected by the lockdown, the decrease in economic activity, etc. So you see, this is a very vulnerable group. If we take into account that there are groups within this bigger group which are even more vulnerable, such as many young girls doing domestic work, unpaid, and Yvonne will be touching upon this. It is vital to look into these impacts in order to design specific policies. I will be wrapping up soon. Next slide, please. I wanted to highlight that it is necessary to understand the links between care and child labor. We saw a virtuous investment in childcare. We also have to bear in mind that we have this kind of vicious cycle. Poverty, uh, for example, the poorer you are, the more care work you do. Households with less income have fewer chances to hire or pay for some services which would alleviate their care burden. If childcare services are not accessible, poor families will not be able to afford them. Therefore, there's more care work at home, and this happens when you are poorer. And when more care work you do, it's more difficult to leave poverty behind because the time we have in our hands, this is the scarce resource. It's only 24 hours. The more time we devote to unpaid care work, the less time we have to generate income generating initiatives which might allow us to leave poverty behind. So that's the reason why many families have to resort to childcare, because they have to find an economic complement to their income. And this because this income cannot be generated by grown-ups because they have to devote their time to childcare. Care work sometimes is the only occupational option for poor women. It is estimated that between 14 and 17% of all women in the region work as domestic workers. And it's precisely the women with the lowest income, and they are extremely poor. And that's another link. If you do precarious, unpaid work without social protection, well, if you do that, you cannot leave this poverty cycle, even if you have some wages. So in order to destroy this vicious cycle, inequality, precariousness, exclusion, and poverty, in order to make a positive contribution to the eradication of child labor, it is fundamental to invest in care systems that can guarantee the proper child care, which is key because it creates dividends, and also we struggle against poverty and the promotion of gender equality. You see, these are all achievable targets simultaneously, provide you make strategic investments in care systems. So these care systems have to be part and parcel of the struggle against COVID. And we have a need for specific plans against COVID so that childcare is the cornerstone of this agenda, so that we can fully attain the 2030 agenda, so that no one is left behind. So that's all from me. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much, Raquel. Well, your explanation has been very clear. I mean, this clear link between the care system that we need more than ever and child labor. Now I will give the floor to Yvonne Urriola. Yvonne has been working very hard on the rights of young boys and girls, and the closure of schools has had enormous impact on the life of children, and this is a factor associated to child labor. So we would like to delve, deeper into some of the recommendations. Yvonne, the floor is yours. Thank you, Anna. Good morning, everyone. I would like to thank the ILO for the invitation to be part of this panel and to engage in this conversation, which is really necessary. I would like to say hello to my colleagues, Maria, Raquel, Neus. It's a pleasure to share this conversation with you so we can exchange ideas as we normally do. So, as Anna was saying, I will focus my presentation on these topics and how gender inequality and education have an impact on child labor or has links with child labor. Um, I will switch off my camera so I don't rob my internet of bandwidth. So now I would like to start by making a general comment. We know that this crisis has had and will have a serious socioeconomic and lasting impact on thousands of families in the region, especially those families with young children, boys and girls. However, we know that the situation of children and teenagers was already serious before COVID. That was a challenging situation because many of their rights had been uh, encroached upon or even violated in many cases. The first analysis that uh, we have conducted is that the crisis has been multiplying some risk factors endured and faced by these young children in the region. That's why we think it's important to reflect upon these links between gender issues and that we find in many countries in the region, education and child labor. And in this framework, in this context, we have asked ourselves some questions. For example, whether the loss or the reduction of household incomes together with temporary school close down increases pressure on children to make an economic contribution to their own families. And also, if this overburden of care activities mentioned by my colleagues, which is being faced mainly by women and girls in the region, has an impact on the time that girls can devote to homework or their own self-realization or their own activities or school homework. And also what measures are necessary at the level of all the actors which are found in each country in the region in order to reduce the risks faced by boys and girls regarding school homework, child labor, and gender violence.
Now, the next slide, please. Very good. We wanted to start by saying that education is a protective factor against child labor. It can delay the entrance of boys and girls into the labor market and guarantee that protection and acquisition of skills, development of skills in order to implement them in adulthood. Now, if we look at the data, education data related to education from a gender perspective, we see that there are inequalities that endanger boys and girls in a different manner. They are affected differently. There is a whole set of data that show the
the gender division in labor applied in adulthood is also applied or seen in the case of boys and girls. So girls are more seen in home care or homework or unpaid work or in third families, not their own families. And boys are pushed to work in paid jobs out of home. So the gender studies on the situation of education in the region show that girls are more prone to entering high school. However, those that don't make it to finish to complete high school, when they drop out, they do it for reasons that are much more different from those that make boys drop out the school system. At the same time, we identify a set of factors that some have already been mentioned as more care burden, but also early pregnancies or early relationships or marriages and child labor. Everything affects systematically school performance, completion of school cycles. So a recent study that we conducted in UNICEF around secondary high school, it showed that 27.5% of girls, of adolescents in the region, do not study or work. It's this group that is known as ninis. You know, they don't study, they don't work. They don't do either one thing or the other. So in comparison with 14.5% of boys. And if we go deeper into that information, we will see that that representation in the care world and paid labor world is the traditional representation. So we also have a whole set of challenges that are more related to education and that also bring an impact to bear on child labor or later on in the life of these children. If we think about segregation, okay, or gender segregation in curricular areas, that is something predominant, still predominant, this shows that girls usually get to better levels in reading and writing, and boys better performance in science and math. In this social organization, which is not related to social gender rules, that is well known by all of us. Now, the factor related to violence in schools and its surroundings, including gender violence. This is a factor that is very, very important and that influences on school performance and also in boys and girls dropping out of a school, especially because many school centers don't have clear reference rules or teachers don't have skills, the necessary skills to identify gender violence situations among their students in their community, education communities. And there is another challenge that is access to digital technological literacy. Of course, the different studies in the region show that it's not equal for all boys and girls. The gender, the ethnic, origin and household income affect access to digital literacy. And among those groups, of course, girls that belong to rural, poorer districts or native population are of a native population background have more difficulty in accessing these digital media. Next slide, please. Although all these elements mentioned before existed before the arrival of COVID-19 into our lives, the impact during and after the pandemic have heightened those inequalities and raising some very relevant concerns around child labor and other elements or aspects affecting the lives of boys and girls in the region. So some of them had to do with the increase in situations such as adolescent pregnancy, children's marriage, and gender violence and child labor, of course. The fact that with the loss or reduction of income in many households, we start to identify an increase in vulnerability and the expectation that boys and girls can contribute financially to the income of their households. So this, on top of the reinforcement of traditional gender roles, different types of pressure is exerted on boys and girls, thus increasing the demand in a different manner for the generation of income in the case of boys, and that girls conduct jobs related to home care and personal care. So in that sense, let me mention that the access, non-technological access, that was already complex before the pandemic. In terms of technological access, the data of the region show that digital learning is damaging those groups of boys and girls that don't have access to technological support such as tablets, portable computers, or no internet access. And the only possibility to maintain as the school attendance and training during this month has been that the school goes through teachers to the homes of those boys and girls in this context. So, based on all these analyses and data that appeared in several countries and also regionally, is that the longer children are out of a school, those boys and girls that belong to those groups that were already marginalized but now are more marginalized, the less likely they are to go back to school, increasing exponentially the risk of child labor. And when we think about who they are, I mean, who are those boys and girls that are more vulnerable or that belong from more marginalized groups? The patterns show that the exclusion in the region is focused on rural areas, native populations, disabilities, people with disabilities, or migrants. So those categories, especially in poor households or with fathers and mothers with low formal education levels. So we require urgent actions to address these impacts that will be even more serious if schools do not open soon. Now, next, please. Briefly, the framework for UNICEF, which is the Gender Action Plan of UNICEF to be in place up until next year, includes many results. I'm not going to go into detail. I just wanted to mention that education is one of the pillars of this Gender Action Plan, both in terms of integrating gender perspective in education, as well as strengthening secondary education for children and the skills for children in general. And let me mention the Gender Action Plan here, UNICEF's plan, because it is very much related to the process that both UNICEF and other agencies, UN agencies, and other partners in the region have developed for many months. There is a framework to reopen schools. Next, please. The school reopening framework is an initiative where UNESCO is involved, the World Food Program, the World Food Program and the World Bank, and everything has been, should be used to assess if education systems or school are ready to reopen the return of boys and girls to school. But it's very important that the gender issues are taken into account as a relevant factor of all the factors involved in the reopening framework, because looking forward, this framework can be relevant in terms of favoring gender equality in education, but also because in the short term, it could contribute to the prevention of child labor for girls and boys, both. Now, let me mention briefly some of the recommendations set forth in this framework of reopening of schools, especially in terms of gender, from the gender's perspective, to take into account these aspects that we have discussed before.
So, next slide, please. So, the first three areas have been summarized. You can see that on the screen. They have to do with three areas, main areas, connected to public policies, funding, and safe operations. Some important elements we should take into account. They have to do. Sorry to interrupt you, Yvonne. I hope you can slow down a little bit, and just to tell you that you have a few minutes left. Thank you. So, I have a few minutes left. I will quickly go over these slides because I would like to focus the remainder of my presentation on some of the final slides of my presentation. Can you please go to slide 11? 5 actions to help more marginalized girls. Thank you. That one, yes, thank you. So, here on the slide, you can see a summary of some of the recommendations I wanted to touch upon in the previous slides. Sorry, you will get the presentation eventually, and we will keep our dialogue through different media. I think it's important to wrap up my presentation with a summary of the priorities, the key priorities to make a contribution so that girls, especially the most vulnerable and marginalized girls, can go back to school after COVID. First recommendation has to do with the fact that the pandemic affects the poorest families in several countries in the region. We have seen this. And we have seen that many groups are finding it difficult even to get proper meals every day. as part of the pandemic. Of course, this makes teenagers more vulnerable to child labor, sexual exploitation, child marriage. So eradicating the different rates or tariffs that are imposed on access to school might make it easier for girls to go back to school. Other strategies like cash transfer for the more marginalized girls have proven useful in other different contexts, not in the region, but have been effective. For example, in prior epidemics experienced by other regions in the world. Also, we think there is a need to widen distance learning, but of course, including a gender perspective in order to reach those girls that are most vulnerable and marginalized in the region. There is, we think, a strong opportunity for countries to transform the way in which they approach boys and girls outside school by designing and widening remote learning programs using appropriate technology. It's fundamental for all these programs to adopt a gender perspective and take into account that normally within families, the families that have access to technology, girls have less access to technology than boys. So it's important to take this aspect into account when designing programs and plans. Third, we believe it is extremely relevant to heighten and intensify community mobilization and community support to the education of girls. It's important for these messages to be contextualized, and they should uh, aim to change gender guidelines and rules which become obstacles to girls' access and progress in education. Fourth, we believe that as countries' data show that gender violence has increased exponentially, child pregnancy is on the rise now with the pandemic. It's important to create an impact so that governments heighten measures to protect girls from gender violence, early marriage, and child pregnancy. Not doing anything in that sense will mean that many girls will not go back to school after the pandemic. So that's the reason why they need special support for these girls so that they go back to school after the COVID is over. And then ensuring the meaningful involvement of young boys and girls. It is true that COVID has especially affected through socioeconomic impact young women and girls. We also think it's important to recognize them as agents of change in their own communities. And for this to be possible, it's necessary for the educational system to encourage children and teenagers to express their views with empowerment. They should be empowered and they should respect every different point of view. So to wrap up my presentation, next slide, please. Yeah, I will be finishing soon. I wanted to share with you a couple of examples. I mean, examples in the sense that we find these relevant experiences, the connection and articulation between child labor and education. These initiatives have been implemented in these two countries in the region, Haiti and Bolivia. We can share with you the links and the documents used by these two programs. But we wanted to highlight that in Bolivia, for instance, this program, these guidelines have been implemented between UNICEF and the Ministry for Equal Opportunities in order to implement a program for children under the age of 14. This is an interagency effort, quite relevant. which shares responsibility of the state, private sector, and these guidelines are targeting government institutions and the private sector, and they place emphasis on monitoring and surveillance, and as well as studies. I wanted to highlight the Haiti Experience. This is a joint effort by the ILO and UNICEF, which is contributing to relevant results, not only in the sense of reinforcement of the framework, legal framework in the country as the review of the code of work and employment rules, but it also is targeting another objective, providing guidance to families and children regarding different areas such as the protection from child labor, taking into account the specific needs of boys and girls, and also with a special focus on those women who are heads of households. So next slide, please. No, just the one before that one. Oh, no, I think I forgot to include it. Well, I just wanted to point out that these key links between education, gender issues, and child labor uh, have to be taken into account. And education is a protective factor against child labor. And we also have to pay attention to inequalities, the inequalities that create risks for boys and girls, but different risks. And also school closures entail higher risks because child labor might go up in this context, and because of this rationale, I mean, the gender division of work, higher burden for girls in the case of unpaid work. And we also need to better articulate these areas in order to dismantle the gender or sexual division of labor while strengthening the continuity of children at school, so that these gender inequalities are tackled so that they disappear in the future. Thank you very much.
It's, excuse me, but of course we could go on forever. It's difficult, I know, to summarize. And I think it's very important what you said, because in our region, we shouldn't forget that there is a possibility to reconcile child labor and school is a reality, you know, so we shouldn't lose sight of that. Now, I would give the floor to Neus Bernabeu from the Population Fund, UNFPA, that has a major focus on adolescents and has developed a line of work that evidences the impact of pregnancies and child marriages and adolescent marriages in the impact that has with those girls, the life of those girls. And that's related to child labor as well, especially domestic work. Thank you. I thank the ILO for the invitation. It's a pleasure to share this panel with all colleagues. Thank you, Anna, for provoking my thought. You know, you made me think about the relationship of between the topics we work on from the population, the fund, and child labor. And this is only the beginning to start establishing more points in common. As you know, the Population Fund focuses its work on physical autonomy and independence of children, young girls, adolescents, and women in order to have a life free from violence and make decisions on their reproduction. We want women, girls, adolescents to make decisions, to be owners, to take ownership of their present and their future. So increasingly so, we have realized that we cannot talk about violence-free life or autonomous women to make a decision on their reproduction without linking this with their economic self-sufficiency. Those girls, those women, have other needs met, and in the case of adults, they are entitled to the right job, and as Maria said, and Raquel said, they had to resolve their care problems. So there is a very strong link between physical autonomy and economic self-sufficiency. So Yvonne also mentioned what I'm going to emphasize now, the relationship with child labor, potential relationship or link, because we are exploring that connection. That's the case of child marriages or unions. And we talk about these phenomena as practices, damaging, harmful practices, because these are traditions that are socially accepted and tolerated in our countries, but they are a clear affront of the rights of children or girls and women to develop. So let me show you the link between those marriages and unions. And we say unions because in the region there are informal unions and forced child pregnancies. And up to what extent, taking into account the definition of child labor, how can this be considered as well child labor or can lead to child labor? Because effectively, it brings an impact to bear the development of girls because they drop out of school, and Yvonne mentioned that, and there is that link. Okay, next slide, please. If you want more details, I will go through this quickly, but if you want more details, UNIPAC has just issued a package that has to do with these social practices that cause irreversible damage in girls that could be socioeconomic, long, short, medium term. In all societies, there are damaging, harmful practices all over the world. No nation, no community is immune to that. And behind these practices, the background of these practices is inequality, gender inequality, the permanence of patriarchal systems in our societies that base and encourage this gender inequality. It has to do with the control of the body, control of sexuality in the case of women and young women, under appreciation of children, of women and girls vis-a-vis men and boys. So these ideas, higher value ideas in the case of boys and men over girls and women end up being social practices, that is, social and gender practices. So as part of these harmful practices, human rights instruments talk at least of 19 known globally, among them child marriage and early forced unions and child pregnancies, forced pregnancies. In the case of Latin America, 1 out of 4 girls is married, but before the age of 18. In some countries in the region, is 1 out of 3 girls. In the case of Nicaragua, Belize, Honduras, Dominican Republic. And the most concerning thing is that this is such an invisible practice. And there is a very strong connection here with child labor in the sense that there is invisibility of these practices, that they go unnoticed, they become natural. And this is the reason why we can say that Latin America and the Caribbean are not moving forward in the fulfillment of the goals of the Sustainable Development Goals to end with child marriage and early unions. So other regions are making progress, but that's not the case in Latin America and the Caribbean. And why is this of concern? Because many times we think that these unions are between adolescents, but data show that mainly, and those are the unions that are of concern to us, that happens between adult men and girls that have not come of age. And the difference in age, sometimes between the man and the girl, is 8 or 10 years. And this is very, very important when we are talking about power trips. So the same happens with adolescent pregnancies. According to the UN Population Fund information, the adolescent reproduction rate is 64 per every 1,000 women between 15 and 19 years of age, ranging from 41 in Chile to 57% in Peru to 85 in Nicaragua. You see in red the countries with a higher rate, and you have a strong red or orange. This means that the number of adolescent pregnancies in those countries are very high. And in the case of child marriages or early unions, there is a low or very slow reduction of this phenomenon in the region. Of course, the adolescent pregnancy is expanded, but at least at a lower rate, more slowly. At this point in time, Latin America and the Caribbean is the second region in terms of adolescent pregnancy rates after Africa. And why is it so difficult to reduce pregnancy in the case of adolescents? Because clearly there is an issue of lack of comprehensive education in sexuality in most of our countries. There is lack of contraceptive methods used. So especially in adolescents and young women, you have unions that are directly linked to adolescent pregnancies and high rates of sexual violence.
And the result is teenage or child pregnancy. This is concerning because these child pregnancy rates have been rising, especially among girls 10 to 14 years of age. And of course, this involves sexual violence. I wanted to show you with this graph the relationship between marriages or unions and teenage pregnancy. You can see data from Ecuador, Argentina, Paraguay, and Mexico. Many of these girls, orange is teenagers 15 to 19. Blue is girls 10 to 14. You can see the bars that many of the girls who are mothers, they were in a union or a marriage. So this union takes place before the pregnancy. And you can see in Mexico, 67% of these girls between 10 and 14 who became mothers were in a union. So when we speak about these unions, are not unions between teenagers, but between a man and a teenage girl. And as I said before, in the criminal codes in the region, not every pregnancy before this age, 15, is considered sexual violence. As Yvonne has said already, and Maria mentioned this, these phenomena do not affect these dangerous practices all girls in the region. Some face special situations and are more severely affected. Who are those most severely affected? Well, girls in the poorest households or families, girls with less education, girls living in rural areas, and girls who are members of indigenous communities. This is information data from UNICEF 2019. You can see rural areas, girls in a union before 18 are much more. In the poorest quintiles, you see an increase in the number. And you see that if we go to the side of wealth, you see numbers go down. And people with no education at all, well, are too many. The same thing happens with teenage fertility rates. It's much higher among indigenous girls, for example, in comparison with other groups. And of course, what are the consequences of these teenage unions or marriages? And well, pregnancy, of course, but there are other consequences. Just they are short-term, middle-term, and long-term consequences, and there is a direct link with school dropout. I will show you that in the next slide. Yvonne has already mentioned that. Of course, unions, as I showed before, well, are prevalent and they result in teenage pregnancy, forced motherhood. Of course, these girls become moms, well, because they have no other option. They have been subjected to sexual violence. It's not their own decision. We also noticed that after the first pregnancy, well, there are more pregnancies. So these girls have higher chances of having more than one children at a younger age. Also, an issue of mortality among these mothers. These girls are not ready. I mean, their body is not ready to become a mom, and there's a risk to mental and physical health. And there is also a loss of human capital. Of course, I don't have time to show you all the details, but we conducted a study to show the impact of all these situations regarding the loss of human capital. There is an intergenerational transmission of poverty. The households where women became mothers at an early age have higher chances of having girls who are also poor and subjected to gender violence. That's why say that the impact of these unions and pregnancies is not only individual but collective. Yeah, it's a violation of rights, and there is a consequence on families and the communities. And we speak of a domino effect of this suffering because there's an escalation, the vulnerability, the violation of human rights, and ongoing suffering. And this is a hindrance to the development of these women and children. I mentioned this study called Milena. It's a socio-economic impact methodology developed by the UN Population Fund, which establishes a link between physical vulnerability and economic autonomy or independence. We believe the socio-economic impact of teenage pregnancy is important and relevant. We conducted this in several countries, Guatemala, Paraguay, Argentina, Ecuador, and Mexico. Now it's been extended to other countries. Probably we will be releasing the uh, uh, report soon. And well, here we see consequences on school achievement. This is affected by teenage pregnancy. I don't know if you can see the graphs and the numbers, but you see the bottom is girls between 10 and 19 years of age. Those girls who became mothers between the age of 10 and 19. On the top green is those between 20 and 29 years of age. We wanted to make a comparison of these trajectories, how this impacts school and educational achievements among these women, depending on their age. And what we see from these data that is that in most countries, the concentration of women in the lowest level of schooling takes place among women who are moms between 10 and 19. You see this direct link between lower school achievement and teenage pregnancy. Same thing in tertiary level. Those who were moms between 20 and 29 have fewer chances of completing secondary education and, of course, going into higher education. You see these gaps in the case of Mexico, 15%. We will share this study with you. And of course, we calculate the implications of this educational delay, among girls and the impact on the entire country, the impact in the future. We measure also the impact on healthcare cost or entry into the labor market by women, or even the impact on tax collection. The purpose of this study is to show evidence of the different impacts generated by teenage pregnancy. Next, please. So, this is a kind of summary of these links. Okay, these are the definitions of child labor. You are all familiar with them. And you see this clearly describes how child labor interferes with schooling, because schooling is combined with hard work, and this is very time consuming. Domestic work, whether at home or at other people's homes, these are two different scenarios, and we should look into them more clearly. Some girls have to drop out school when they get pregnant and find a way to sustain themselves or to make an economic contribution to their own family. You see the connection between pregnancy and child labor. These girls have to find, a way to make a living. It's also important to take into account that if you're a mom when you are a young girl and you have a relationship with a grown-up, well, that should not be considered normal. That should be considered the kind of work with the heart, which is the hardest with the most burdens. So we think that we have to reflect and ponder how these practices create a connection between child labor and these pregnancies and forced motherhood. And this is a kind of provocation, I would say, to provoke your thought, to spark off your reflection, and to see the connection and bridge between these different topics. So I will be wrapping up with this. Thank you very much.
It's not only thought-provoking, but it's also to generate knowledge and go deeper into gender in the case of child labor that has intersection and links with other topics being addressed in the region. So I would like now open up the forum for questions made by participants throughout this conversation. And thank you for the participation. And before starting with questions to the panelists, let me address two comments on the chat box. One was about how, from gender perspective in child labor, we may run the risk of neglecting children or boys. So to go deeper into gender perspective in child labor is that all children at risk, boys and girls, can have the protection that is affordable. So girls, because they are more invisible and because of the traditional gender roles they inherit, they are more neglected. So in that sense, we require differential attention or initial attention that has not existed so far. And the other comment I would like to read, because in the ILO three-party practice is important. in the role played by unions in control and protection. And this would make jobs that have been invisible visible. And that's important to enforce these goals of child labor eradication and gender equality impacting on boys and girls and men and women. That is important, the role played by the ILO and unions in this sense. So now, some questions for the panelists. Maria, they wanted to ask a question. It's here on the chat box. It says, there are social studies that can determine that child labor in many cases is influenced by social culture, especially culture in the sense of Aboriginal population. So how can you work along those lines without neglecting the tradition, the culture of teenagers and girls? Okay, the ILO has taken this very seriously. I don't know if you know that the ILO is also a custodian of the 169 Convention. That is the only international binding regulation on labor and indigenous and the rights of indigenous populations. And the 169 Convention has a section or article number 8 establishing the compatibility or how to match the habits and customs of native populations and other rights. And these uses and customs should be preserved whenever they are not compatible with fundamental rights of the country. So the Children Convention makes it education, but not only the education of the right to play, to playing and health be one of those fundamental rights. So it is important to establish these links. We saw how many of these early unions happen in Aboriginal populations, not because these are uses and customs. You shouldn't protect those rights of the girls to go to school and equality and not reproduce the poverty cycle. Now, in the ILO conventions, it says that not all work is child labor. There is labor that allows children to be socialized, that plays an educational role, but the issue is when to define that when this becomes child labor, and that should be eradicated. So work that prevents education, that endangers the health and well-being of boys and girls. But we have to understand that this is difficult to do in practice. Statistically, when we measure child labor, statisticians measure number of hours. They say, okay, if they work more than 2 or 3 hours, that would be child labor. That is not necessarily the case. There could be a 2-hour job that uses chemicals that is hazardous for their health, but you cannot ask that in a questionnaire. But it's interesting to see that there have been ILO projects and from other NGOs that have worked with indigenous populations. Many times the idea that it is childhood, that it is adolescence, of what is childhood, what is adolescence, what is labor, is different as seen by these Aboriginal communities. And these projects have built together with the communities that have a very strong protection of children to build with them which would be the permitted labor and the labor to be avoided. In the Andes, in Peru, there are some projects, and in Argentina as well, with indigenous populations where you build together with them the type of work to be abolished. You agree with them, but uses and customs should not leave aside the fundamental rights of boys and girls. Let me mention as well this idea because statistically we do not recognize domestic work as work. So the ILO has to recognize, has recognized that, and we have to support that. The work done by children in many cases is recognized as work, while the contribution, even the economic contribution of unpaid domestic work is not recognized. And that's the first step, as emphasized by the ILO. We had to change it, but first we have to acknowledge that, recognize that.
Thank you, Maria. Now, a question for Raquel. Are there any successful examples in any country which can show you or provide figures, numbers about the impact and how it can impact the generation and expansion of networks, widow networks? And you will have to analyze the links, the connections, but do you have any kind of piece of information to share? Thank you. Well, I don't know any study which quantifies that direct impact. What I know is that there are some studies that describe this link between poverty and child labor, what I mentioned in my presentation. I feel that child labor is a consequence often of poverty, and this link between care overburden and poverty, well, that's a link as well. And at the end of the day, these are all elements that when they are tackled, yeah, comprehensively, we can combat all of them at the same time. You can combat poverty by promoting good care systems, I mean, good conditions, decent conditions for those involved and doing this work. Many of them are poor people because even if they work, they have bad working conditions. So if we tackle these situations and we can create more time for workers, for people, also can generate sustainable means of life. And also this can prevent certain situations in which other members of the family, young boys and girls, can make a living, to make a contribution to their family by resorting to child labor. Child labor is a consequence mainly of poverty, and everything which alleviates poverty will go against child labor and or this link. Thank you, Raquel. For Yvonne now, a question which has to do with education. How can the educational system guarantee the reduction of this gap between gender inequality and child labor? So that's what I said before. As we have said, these are areas that we have to explore, but of course, I give you the floor all the same for an answer. Thank you. Yes, I think there is several ways to do it or to face this. The studies that have been conducted in the area of educational systems and the link with gender inequality provide some key elements, but we think about the link with child labor, maybe I wouldn't mention three key elements, but top of my mind, I might say, just top of my mind, I would say that maybe we have to think about addressing educational or learning needs among boys and girls. If we think of the current context, this will probably last some more time. I think educational systems have to guarantee access to good learning teams, which is a kind of faraway reality in this region. Countries such as Uruguay, which began by providing a computer to each child in the country. This has shown that at this moment, at this time, in this context, in the crisis, has made everything easier. Has made it easier for children to remain within the educational system. And this reduces risk factors regarding child labor. I also think that we have to see how we can reinforce, strengthen what has been mentioned by different organizations. I mean, girls' access to skills or STEM, science, technology, engineering, mathematics. As you know, uh, school curriculum does not really promote these skills explicitly for girls. And this leads to girls' educational choices in the future. And this affects their access to certain types of jobs. So maybe we should look into this need. Well, right now is an educational need which has a strong connection with the needs of the labor market. I mean, the labor market now and the labor market in the future. I think we should work with teachers, with teaching teams to see how we can impact educational curricula in the countries in order to spark transformations, deep transformations, in order to transform stereotypes and gender issues. I mean, this sounds like common sense, but we have not fully made progress in a sustained way in the region at least. And I think that we need to take all this accumulated knowledge about gender inequality and introduce it into educational programs and plans and the work we do with teachers. I think it's the time not to waste any more time. So my last question.
For NEOs, what are the key actors that should bring an impact to bear on the reduction of teenage pregnancies? And is there an example of a country where this has worked? All these social interventions require, yes, a multi-sectorial intervention. We have to work, of course, from the healthcare sector to make information accessible in terms of contraceptives, detect gender violence situations, sexual violence situation. We have to work together with the education sector. If girls, teenagers, and young women don't receive comprehensive sexual education, they won't have the information not only to make decisions on contraceptive methods, but also decisions that have to do with the independence of the body, the relationship with others, and sex equality, because this is a key strategy for the prevention of violence. So it has to do with the mechanisms acting in terms of child protection and many other stakeholders as well. We have experiences in Uruguay. It's a benchmark case in the region because they managed to reduce significantly the rate of teenage pregnancies. We cannot hear Neus, says the moderator. It seems the sound was cut off. Very well then. It's important to take that information that in Uruguay, Certain policies have worked to reduce significantly teenage pregnancy rates. And it's a benchmark for the Ceibal plan that they have of laptops, portables for children that has worked very well during the pandemic because of the closing of certain schools. Okay, we took more time than scheduled. Let me thank, first of all, Raquel, Yvonne, Neus, Maria, because this allows us to start some talks and conversations and studies and start learning, which is so necessary to focus gender or to include gender in the field of child labor. And this is initially thought-provoking, of course, but it can lead to very good results. And from the American and Caribbean Latin American initiative, we would like to contribute our effort. So thank you very much for all those that participated from all over the world. This is advantageous to go virtual. So the recording you will be able to find in the Facebook Red Latinoamericana contra el Trabajo Infantil, that's the name in Spanish, and we could be here for many, many hours talking about these topics. Thank you. I thank the panelists and the participants, and see you soon. Thank you.